All right, so we left off our last module, welcome back, talking about lab reuse, how to maintain this environment when you want to redo something, undo something potentially, without having to basically rebuild the entire environment, tear it all down from scratch and rebuild everything. So Tim's going to tell us about the different options, technologies, and ways that we can reuse this lab environment, basically reset it back to clean without having to tear it down and rebuild it.
Right. Planning for lab reuse. Let's take a look at our formal agenda here. We'll look at something called operating system deployment just briefly, because honestly, this is yet another case where you may find this compelling enough to where you could feasibly build an entire career on deploying operating systems and services. A good friend of mine actually back in Nashville named Mick he's a very successful guy and enjoys his work very much, and he does OSD for his career. So I think that this lab experimentation is useful for yet another reason to help you discover where your professional passion lies. We're going to introduce this auto lab for you, but certainly we don't have the time or scope to get into depth. It really does warrant its own deep dive course, but I'm going to give you enough information here to get you started and hopefully at the least pique your interest to where you'll be willing to invest some time and effort in it, because it makes it a lot easier, believe me, to set up and reset labs. But first, this concept called OSD that's important enough nowadays to where I said people will build an entire career doing it. And it makes sense when you think of larger enterprise businesses that may need to refresh desktop workstations every day, that to automate that is going to save a lot of time and money and effort. And in our context as IT certification candidates, it's also going to save us time and effort, if not money. In operating system deployment nomenclature, we have three categories of installation. The high-touch installation, as Microsoft calls it, is where you do a manual installation. And this is likely how you're going to initially set up your IT certification practice lab, by mounting an ISO DVD image and then walking through click, 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 making steps. That's fine for learning and for one-off, but that gets tiring after a while. In the light touch installation, or LTI scenario, here we can take advantage of toolkits like Microsoft's Window Deployment Services, WDS. WDS is a service that's built into Windows Server that makes it easier to automate operating system deployment. There's the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit, or ADK as it's called, and LTI allows you to automate most of an operating system installation and even slipstream things like service packs, other updates, drivers, this sort of thing into your installations, but there's still normally some manual intervention. You may have to choose an operating system image to deploy, and then the rest of it's automated.
Or even then you've got, you may even have pre-built images. You can still have an image that's got certain things installed, but you've still got to maintain that image. You talk about slipstreaming. Not everything can be slipstreamed if you've put tools and applications into your OS image. So you may have to update those images from time to time. So yeah, it's faster, it's easier, still not quite to the wonderful world of where we want to be.
Yeah, so you can see we're already getting into the weeds here with the notion of a thick versus thin image, which is what Christopher was talking about. Do you want to go for a really bare bones image and then after the fact you layer on software? Or do you want to try to have a monolithic image that includes not only the operating system, but a whole bunch of update files to bring it to a certain level of being current? And then line of business applications, drivers, like I said, it's a career unto itself.
And these are terms you're going to hear: monolithic images, thin images, layering on applications. Yeah, I'm listening to this like, yeah, these are the terms.
Yep. Ultimately, I guess the goal would be zero-touch installation, or ZTI. And in on-premises environments, the System Center toolset, specifically System Center Configuration Manager, that's what it does in large part, is allow you to do hands-off automated operating system deployment.
And I start grinning as we talk about this, because Config Manager is one of the technologies I used to manage and then used to teach. Loved Configuration Manager, still love Configuration Manager. I trained a couple of gentlemen from an enterprise here, actually a local company here in Seattle, but a big global enterprise, who there were two of them, and their entire job was operating system deployment using Config Manager. The scripts they had built, the automation they had built was astounding to me. It was phenomenal.
It is. There's a lot of free toolkits that Microsoft makes available to help this. I mentioned the ADK. There's also the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, or MDT. And these tools all fit together. Actually, by the time you're at ZTI, or Zero Touch, you're using Configuration Manager alongside ADK, MDT, WDS, and there's probably several other TLAs, or three-letter acronyms that I'm leaving off.
Probably true. Configuration Manager, however, is not free.
Right, good.
Part of the System Center suite, but highly recommended.
That's a point that's worth saying. That having been said, guess what's in the Evaluation Center? The System Center family.
System Center suite.
Very lucrative possibilities specializing in data center management. Okay, next we have this AutoLab project, which is an open source community project whose aim is to simplify the deployment of a lab environment to where you can run a script theoretically and then go get yourself a cup of coffee, and then get yourself another cup of coffee, and maybe go get groceries, because it's going to take a while. But at the end of the process, you have a fully functional multi-node lab. Really cool tool here. So let's just investigate some basics of it first. First of all, AutoLab is free and open source software, or FOSS. It uses the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT license, and it's hosted at GitHub, which again means that you can clone the project down to your desktop and work with the source code. You can fork the project, which means make a copy of it into your GitHub account and make changes to your own copy of the project and potentially submit those changes back to the master via what's called a pull request. And at the end of that process, you can have great satisfaction in having contributed to this project. It's a good thing. The tools that are used in AutoLab besides Windows PowerShell is another open source project called Lability. So we could look at AutoLab as an extension of the Lability project. Lability in turn has the same basic goal as AutoLab does. AutoLab just adds a management layer using Windows PowerShell. The workflow here is, as I said, to not only allow you to set up a lab, but also to refresh it, in other words, reset it to its original configuration, and ultimately, if you need to or want to decommission or destroy the lab just with a single line of PowerShell. So with that, let's walk through a couple of these concepts.
It's interesting. In this, we get to this module, and my brain just says, I really want to spend hours and hours. I want to show off MDT. I want to show off Config Man. I want to show off, I mean, even just the basic image management tools built into Server. They're such phenomenal tools. So
yes,
maybe we'll have to get some classes. Take a look on MVA. That we've done some deployment work before. I'm not sure we have a configuration manager course up right now, but I know I have it on my schedule, so it's coming. But yeah, deployment's one of those weird things that I just love doing for some reason. I don't know why. It's one of those things I took to in IT.
Let's begin in Hyper-V Manager, because although we didn't mention it in the slides a moment ago, it occurred to me that you should know about checkpoints if you don't already. For instance, you may, in your lab environment, want to deploy on your MEM1 member server, let's say, Exchange server, but you're doing so in a way that's going to be temporary, to where you'll install it and then you'll want to roll it back to where the virtual machine was before you installed Exchange server. For these sorts of things, you can do checkpointing. And a checkpoint is going to be a point in time, well, snapshot or checkpoint, they're synonyms really, of that virtual machine state. And what you see me doing here, this VM happens to be off, but if we right-click a running VM, we can come down to checkpoint, and it tells us in the status area here, creating checkpoint. It may take a little while depending upon how large the virtual machine is. This is going to give a representation of the virtual machine's memory state and persistent disk space. So it's more than with, say, Windows System Restore, let's say, in Windows Client, that allows you to roll back software installations and registry changes. But this is you're actually rolling back the entire VM state to a previous point in time. So we now see that when we select DC1, we have a checkpoint tree where we're going to have time and date stamped checkpoints that we can work with. We can make a connection directly to a checkpoint state. We can apply a previous state. So, for instance, you'd run a checkpoint before making a large configuration change on that virtual machine. And then if you want to roll back to the previous version, you could, in your checkpoint list, right-click the previous checkpoint and choose Apply. Notice that there's also some delete options. Hopefully it makes sense that these checkpoints can be pretty heavy in the disk space usage department. So you want to be judicious in how many checkpoints you're running. And it can be difficult, especially when you have a multi-node virtual network like we have here, in terms of consistency. In that example I gave a few minutes ago, you might have Exchange Server up and running, but if you've ever installed Exchange Server, one of the first things it does is extends the Active Directory schema. So you're actually making changes not only to that Exchange Server host, but also to DC1, which is our domain controller. So you may need to snapshot the entire group of VMs instead of just one, you see. Now, if you're wondering, can you do all these things with Windows PowerShell? You absolutely can. As long as you have the Hyper-V feature installed, you can open up an elevated PowerShell prompt, and we can apply general purpose PowerShell like you may be used to. For instance, we can do a get command from the module called Hyper-V. It's probably got a dash in it. Yep, it sure does. And it comes back with a whole bunch of commandlets that allow you to do just about anything. Just for grins, let's figure out how many commandlets there are. I'm going to up arrow, and I'm going to pipe that get command module Hyper-V to measure object. And you see here that the count is 232. So there's a lot of commands here. Virtual switch configuration, snapshotting. In fact, let's quickly check that. Let's do a get command from the module Hyper-V, where the noun portion of the command includes checkpoint. I'm going to do star checkpoint star to just, came back with nothing. Interesting. Could have a different name for that commandlet set. Let me just take a quick scan through the commandlet list here and see if anything jumps out. Yeah, here we go. Restore VM snapshot. Don't mean to turn this into a PowerShell class, but I hope what I'm doing is familiar to you. In other words, you've gotten far enough in PowerShell to where this doesn't seem too foreign. Christopher mentioned that there is MVA training by Jason Helmick. I believe Jason and Jeffrey Snover did it.
Yep. With
Jeffrey Snover being the inventor of Windows PowerShell.
They've done a couple.
So I was just looking for the wrong term here. It looks like the commandlets all have the noun VM snapshot. And you have your traditional verbs where you can get VM snapshot, you can export, remove, and restore, but I'm not seeing one to create a new one. Again, that's off track, but I give that to you as a homework assignment. See if there's a native PowerShell commandlet that allows you to snapshot a VM. And if there is not one in the native Hyper-V module, homework assignment part 2 is for you to look out to the community. There's websites like the PowerShell Gallery. You could go to GitHub directly and look and see if someone wrote a commandlet. It would be a PowerShell function in all likelihood that extends basically upon the snapshot process. Okay, now let's keep this demo up here and we'll go out to github.com. And if you do a search for Autolab, the specific repository is under Jason Helmick's repo, which is the Jason Helmick, and the repo is called ps-autolab-env for environment. And when you first look at it, if you've never dealt with GitHub before, you see all these files and you're like, well, what do I click? What do I download? It can be a little overwhelming at first. There's definitely a learning curve. But Jason, being a trainer himself, understands the importance of documentation. So you'll see here, there's some descriptive blurbs, there's a release history, there's the requirements, and this definitely is worth going over with you briefly. The host computer, or the hardware computer, needs to be running WMF5, in other words, PowerShell v5. You can install PowerShell v5 on Windows, definitely Windows 8.1. I'm 90% sure you can install PowerShell 5 on Windows 7. And Windows 10 will automatically have WMF5. You'll need an internet connection, at least 16 gigs of hardware RAM, and minimum of 100 gigs of free disk space. That, again, seems like a lot, but remember, we're dealing with downloading ISOs that are typically 4 or 5 gigabytes apiece, and the virtual hard drives themselves can easily balloon out to 20 gigabytes. Tells us that the lab tool is validated to work on Windows Server 2016 or Windows 10. So really, in the best case scenario, you're going to need a Windows 10 hardware host that has a decent amount of disk space and RAM. Let's see. It tells us that it'll build virtual environments with the following OSs: Server 2012 R2, Server 2016, Windows 8.1, and Windows 10. Well, conveniently, those are largely the operating systems that I suggested you look into. The instructions. You'll notice that Jason gives you a link to a video that he did and hosted on YouTube. That's what you're seeing here. In fact, that's Jason right there teaching it. It's a video called Windows Server 2016 Auto Lab Setup. It's about a half hour, and he walks through it step by step. This is the short list of instructions here. And let's see, let me quickly check it out and remember it, and then I'm going to demo it very quickly. Like I said, we don't have the scope to let it run. I mean, it takes a long time to set up the lab anyway. Well, what you'll want to do after you watch the video is download the project, and in GitHub, you want to look for releases. You see here, we've got 6 releases. We'll click that icon, and we'll go for the latest release and download that to your system. It comes down as a zip file, and you'll extract it to your hard drive. Pretty sure I have it already done. Yes, here it is right here. I've extracted it to a folder called PS Autolab N301. And there's a PowerShell script here, there's a README, there's a bunch of subfolders. Basically, you will open up a PowerShell console, or the ISE. You'll navigate to that location, so I'll CD the CPS tab, and then you do a //setup/host.ps1. / is a Linux Unix construct that we use in PowerShell to tell Windows basically, we want to run this script from the current directory without specifying a path. So //setup host, and this will do a number of things. The first thing it'll do is ask us where we want to install everything, and it defaults to the path C Autolab. And if you're okay with that, we can just type N for no. We don't want to change the default path. And then it tells us what it's going to do. It says this script will set the trusted host store to star, which allows for PowerShell remoting to work when you're outside of a domain. It goes out to the PS gallery and downloads the Lability module. It'll install client Hyper-V. It'll create the folder structure for you. It'll copy all of its stuff, for lack of a better term, into that folder. In so doing, it'll actually go out to the evaluation center and download the ISOs for Server 2016, Server 2012. That's where most of your time waiting is going to be while it's bringing down all that stuff. It says you will have to reboot your host before continuing. Now, the way that Jason and team wrote the script is that it'll do checks, that if you already have client Hyper-V, it sees that and goes on. It's not going to break the script. When you reboot the system, it's then time to actually start using the tool. And let's come back to the main documentation page, and I'll show you how to start one of the configurations. I'll scroll down. Yep, it's under the configuration folder. There's specific instructions for each one. So if I come back to Windows Explorer, the File Explorer, and go into configurations, as of this recording, it looks like there are 5 different configurations. There's one called DevOps PowerShell Fundamentals, another one that's a proof of concept of the JIA, the Just Enough Administration capability of PowerShell. There's one called multi-role. There's one called single DC and single server. If we go into one like multi-role, there's a README file or an instructions file. I'm going to double left click it. It looks like it'll open up in Visual Studio Code by default if you have code loaded on that system. And these are simply going to be your instructions for building a specific environment. And what that's going to automate is building the virtual network in Hyper-V, creating the virtual machines, starting them up, and getting them all linked together. For some reason, VS Code did not want to open that file for me. Let me do a file, open file. Go to my AutoLab folder. Go into configurations, go into multi-role, and open instructions. Here it is. And what I wanted to draw your attention to is just this first piece here, that the help file will tell you right off the bat what it will do. And if we deploy the multi-role lab, it's going to give us one Windows Server 2016 domain controller, one member server that's evidently running the graphical desktop, one nano server, and one client that already has the RSAT tools installed. So I hope that that basically gets you stoked. I know I was stoked when I first saw this, at how flexible the tool can be for you.
Like I mentioned, at some point, we will look into doing a course where we really, purely for the sake of the technology, tear into AutoLab in terms of PowerShell scripting and the end results and the prerequisites, and that actually seems like a really fun idea to me. So
yeah, by deep
watch for that.
By deep diving into AutoLab, there's not simply the goal of the labs themselves. There's actually a lot of education on PowerShell scripting best practices and best practices for using PowerShell in a DevOpsy way. Lessons learned. Using AutoLab, I think this is going to repeat what I just said. Sure enough, it conveys a couple nice benefits. Windows PowerShell experience, and I didn't mention this, but it's a good idea to sooner rather than later appreciate version control, because you may get into IT and find yourself in a DevOps environment, and if you're a sysadmin, you'll need to know the developer's point of view and a lot of programmer speak. Vice versa, programmers are reliant upon QA and operations people and need to know some things about network and systems. And Git version control is a good nexus or connection point between those worlds.
And good advocacy for, again, we talked about Visual Studio earlier, because
Right.
it's got the same functionality. It's different, obviously, in implementation, but Git and Visual Studio both offer version control and source control options that you'll want to get familiar with.
Oh yeah, yeah. Visual Studio, including the Community Edition, the free version, you can integrate with any version control system. There's Visual Studio Team Services, there's Git, there's Subversion, there's a number of them, that's true. So our next module is actually the last one. I'm feeling a bit wistful here. It's called Integrating Microsoft Azure into the Mix. I added the into the mix part, but it's relevant.
It is.
So look forward to seeing you then.